Today's culture is a result of abusing the concept of relativity. I can subscribe to the fact that things are relative to the time, the place, the geography, the culture, etc., in many aspects of life. Many of our social norms are relative to our society, neither good or bad, just normal to us. But there are obviously things that we all, or most of us, accept to have some kind of foundation to build on. In theory, some of the foundation changes while other parts get refined or we start to understand them better. But at the end of the day, we're trying to understand a reality where our reference is those before us and our own experiences. In today's world, those are becoming increasingly difficult to define as certain foundations are being challenged, muddying the waters to what is true and what is perceived to be true. A good example of this is transgenderism. Males are male because of various genetic differences, some of which result in physiological differences. The most obvious ones being a presence of a penis and testes, and I believe this is a result of having an X and a Y chromosome. Same goes for females, but they obviously have a vagina and ovaries, and 2 X chromosomes. The other physical differences are, but aren't limited to having breasts, wider hips, smaller stature, and a different fat distribution to certain areas, at least for women. For men, it might be having wider shoulders, larger stature, presence of an Adam's apple, and facial hair. It seems absolutely silly to have to even set this as a baseline, but something as harmless or sterile as this has been labeled as inflammatory, if it's used in ways that are deemed unfair or immoral. Gender has gone from a concept strongly associated with one's biological sex to one that is almost exclusively seen as a social construct by many of the authority and institutions of today. While the fight for gender rights or gender equality is seen as an uphill battle against the troublesome existing status quo, the opposite is closer to the truth, as the status quo backs this fight with financial funding and advertising campaigns that go to further diverge or separate two differing groups by setting a playing field based on morality and not merit. This undermines the character of anyone who opposes their arguments while preventing many people from doing so. In regards to the gender debate, it has regressed to attacking the biological basis for sex. People refer to sex as being assigned at birth, or use terms such as birthing persons instead of biological woman. The infatuation with redefining gender has transgressed to children as well. Some parents are convinced that they do the right thing. With the advice of medical professionals and influence from both NGO and government officials, they push sexuality and adult concepts onto children and assassinate the character of those who stand up against what would have largely been considered criminal and immoral only a decade ago. Somehow we've gotten to a point where people would spend between, 6 and 8 years in college becoming medical professionals to provide sex reassignment surgeries to minors. And they're convinced that they're truly minimizing the suffering and being faithful to their Hippocratic oath. The sex reassignment surgery sector is growing at a large rate, due to triple in an 8-year period. There's ongoing social pressures to normalize not normal things and encourage conformity to it. It makes me wonder if these doctors are succumbing to the peer pressure and money coming their way to themselves normalize and encourage the exploration of experimental and irreversible drugs and surgery to children and adults who could explore other, less permanent types of care and assistance, seeing as they're deemed high risk already. It's interesting how we can have one aspect of medicine talk about the importance of one's childhood in their development, and another advocating for intrusive and high-risk elective surgeries for children while they are still developing. It's probably not an uncommon belief to think trauma can shape the perception of information and how children develop overall. Yet for some reason, irreversible surgery or drugs to a child who have at best a fantastical notion of sex or sexual identity seems utterly cruel. We learn about sex when we are hanging out with other kids in school, talking on the playground, Maybe there's things that we hear from older siblings or we see on TV, but we weren't forced to make a decision on where we stood in the spectrum of sexuality. Most of us don't know what all the options for employment are when we're 18, let alone know what all the different sexualities or spectrum-based gender identities we want to explore when we're 8. Pushing conversations about a child's perceived sexuality or gender identity when they're interested in playing with action figures or Barbies, sports or playing house, is a good way to confuse and stunt development as you introduce foreign concepts and constraints, hell, even labels, into a child's mind who is simply exploring the world around them. Aside from children, we as adults have let other adults convince other adults that they should be able to compete with people of the opposite sex. Somehow in these situations, one's gender identity has a transformative effect where their gender identity morphs their biology. Somehow the social construct is so powerful that it can actually circumnavigate the rules of the universe to influence the innate biology that has existed in man since the dawn of humanity. It's truly an amazing feat, or we might just be letting people bullshit us. I think the majority of people know that there are physical differences between men and women. We established that in the beginning of the video. Those physical differences have real-world impacts when it comes to competing physically. I know it's a difficult chain of logic, but it does check out. Just stay with me. We can find evidence of that in nearly any sport that is of an equal playing field for men and women. Track and field is a great example. Look at any distance for men and compare it to the world record for women. Some have wider margins than others, but you will see that the best men in the world consistently outperform the best women in the world. And while the margins may seem to be small, when you look at where these women would place on the men's team if they were competing against men, it shows a sobering reality of why this isn't examined by trans or women's athletics activists. I don't mean to be insulting, but it's not hard to understand the argument against having transgender women or biological men competing in female sports. Consider the world record holder for the women's 100 meter, the esteemed late great Florence Griffith Joyner. She still holds that record today, but if you placed her in the men's bracket, she would precisely tie for 7,373rd place. This has implications for both the women's sport needs more pay and the transgender women should compete with women arguments. The women pay in sports has gotten steam in the past few years with the women's national team for soccer, and more recently with the WNBA, especially with Caitlin Clark being drafted. There's talks about how little she'll make in her WNBA contract compared to that of an NBA man. The common counter-argument to the pay is that they bring in less viewership and thus less money. I think this is the case for most sports that are nearly or exactly identical when it comes to the man and the women's version. Women's MMA, women's soccer, women's tennis, women's track, women's hockey, etc. In the WNBA's case, I know that teams have innate value, but the league itself seems to operate on a loss from certain things I've seen. I believe that the most common argument for more pay and for incorporation of the transgender athletes is that they're equal to men and they should earn the same since they can do the same. If we incorporate women into men's leagues, it would truly be the most fair thing if we're assuming that both men and women, transgender men and transgender women, can all do the same. There would be small speed bumps to get over as some of these aren't one-to-one the same sport, so the rule differences would have to be ironed out. In the WNBA in particular, the women have virtually the same game except for the size of the ball and the distance of the three-point line. If they incorporated NBA rules, the three-point line would be about 1.5 feet deeper and the ball exactly an inch larger in circumference. the three-point line distance having more obvious implications as it takes more range to hit a three, but the size of the ball affects all kinds of shooting, as if the ball gets bigger, the margin of error on a shot will get smaller. Women's hockey doesn't incorporate hitting, which would be a major adjustment to their game. Many players can go their whole career without fighting, but that was still an aspect of the game that would be new to the female players. Females would still need to have an expectation of the need to avoid an inevitability of getting hit by large men going fast. I believe that women's MMA, tennis, soccer, and track have the same rules, so no real adjustments would need to be made. Women's UFC has 115, 125, 135, and 145 pound divisions. The only division that wouldn't have men to compete with is 115, due to the American market. Plenty of strawweight men exist on the planet. They would just need to be sourced from Southeast Asian markets and South American markets to develop the weight class, as there is more opportunity for lighter fighters in those regions. The flyweight, bantamweight, and featherweight divisions could easily be incorporated where we have champion versus champion fights. For the UFC, it would be a truly record-breaking card. So what would this all look like? It's all just speculation, but for some sports there's previous things that we can reference to get a good idea. There's videos of sparring or other training camp videos that you can watch, but as a caveat, you can't really take training camp videos seriously. They're almost always edited and only show part of the picture, so I really shouldn't even show them.
Yes. Oh!
On YouTube, you can find other compilations of women beating men or men beating women. There's not a lot of real fight footage in a professional environment unless you go to Russia or someplace overseas. When you watch those organizations, you're usually talking about a lower level fighter that has less exposure and less of a following than a high school running back in Texas. These aren't exactly the best examples for either side, as it's not elite versus elite. Combat is one of the most primal forms of competition that there is. There are reasons that we don't see women fight men, and think about prime Mike Tyson versus prime whatever the women's best heavyweight there is, or prime Anderson Silva versus prime whatever the women's best 185 pounder there is. These are things that don't really need to be described. I've also seen videos and news stories about women getting beaten by men in soccer. And not pickup, but national teams getting beaten by 18U, 16U, or low-tier professional squads that are fighting relegation. When it comes to tennis or track, you can look at the metrics and stats to see the hurdles women will face. Billie Jean beat Bobby Riggs back in the day, and that lent credence to the notion that the best women could beat the best man. Similarly, a hungover German beat Serena and Venus when they were nearing their pinnacle, and he was a lowly ranked male. Men serve faster than women, so expect difficulty returning the serve. Contrarily, men are used to faster serves, limiting the women's wheelhouse to finesse. Track women will be running against men who consistently place higher. The stat from above doesn't just exist on 100 meters, but the women's 200-meter record holder would place 10,314th. It even exists as you go farther out to the marathon, as the world record holder for women would tie 2,559th place in the men's division. These kinds of things would just exist side by side when the most elite of the elite compete, for example, in the Olympics. Women would have difficulty finding success when they have to deal with the physicality of the professional men hockey players. Men's shots are harder, their hits are harder, and the game is more physical by default, leaving women in a more difficult place to earn their spot. The ones that did would likely have to be goal scorers or playmakers that rely solely on their skill and not on any physicality. Men have existed in the league doing this. There would just need to be a woman who provided enough points for her team to justify having her. Lastly, basketball would end poorly. Women's centers in the WNBA average at 6'4", leaving them undersized in the NBA. Seeing that the guards range from 6 foot to 6'8"-ish, most women's centers would likely have to abandon the big man game in favor of a guard skill set, or at least forward, to have the likelihood of finding a home. For the women guards, it looks like they average around 6 foot, which isn't that far from the males. There will be a hell of an adjustment both offensively and defensively, though, as the top 5 tallest WNBA players ever ranged from 7'2" to 6'9". These ladies are going to be playing against that every night for 82 games a year. This isn't meant to say that women suck at sports or that trans athletes shouldn't compete. It's just that things should be viewed for how they are. If an athlete identifies as a female, that's fine, but it doesn't change the reality that everybody else sees. It's rather solipsistic and self-centered to demand that everyone view you as how you want to be seen. We all have to work for that, and at the end of the day, there's no way for that ultimate control. It's never guaranteed. You be who you are, and the pieces will fall where they do. We can't control people against their will. History has shown that that's not a good precedent. Just because you feel like you're a woman doesn't change the fact that biologically you don't need to get pap smears. It's not meant to be insulting, but it becomes insulting when the person who is going through a gender identity or a sexual situation projects their own uncertainty and negative emotions to others who don't perceive them as they want to be seen. Just because I think I'm the smartest person in the world doesn't mean that I am, or that you have to think it. If I make you feel bad because you don't think I'm the smartest person in the world, it just goes to show that I have some stuff I need to work out, as I'm acting like an asshole. So all in all, let's start being real and stop being so sensitive. Fallon Fox would have sucked as a male mixed martial artist and was only able to beat up females until she fought a real mixed martial artist in Ashley Evans Smith. There will always be women who can compete, and even a select elite few that can hang with the select elite men. But when it comes down to it, let's appreciate everyone for whatever they are, have an understanding for those trying to figure out what they are, and be reasonable when it comes to how you are presenting yourself to the world. We don't always get back what we put out, but we can only control what we put out. That's it. I'm out. See ya.